There we go. Now I just gotta wait for my people to get here. Let's see. Custom 10 days 30 seconds. There we go. And we back. Woo! Hey. Slap Ham got something interesting going on there. That's definitely the type of content that I would have playing in the background as I'm sitting here knocking out these orders for you guys. But can't nobody do it like this man here. Can't nobody do it like this man here. The way he tells stories just pulls me in. So we're about to listen to the GOAT of the storytelling, the male goat, because there's some female goats out there too. Shout out to Rotten Mangoes and a few others. Shout out to Desiree, our moderator, put me on to her. Man, I like her. I like her a lot. Shout out to her. Her stories are very good. If y'all never heard of Swoops or Swoop, definitely go check out her channel. Phenomenal content creator. Definitely go check out her channel. Okay, let's see here. All right, cool. We're good. And we're back. Oh, we already done hit 250 live. Y'all know what that means. What up, AOK Mafia? It's your boy Artofkickz, and just like that, we back with another one. It's time for some Mr. Ballalena. He got an interesting story here. This one is titled, "A Disaster You Never Heard Of Is Still Controlling Our Timeline." That right there was enough to pull me in and get me interested and excited about this story. So we're about to check it out. For those of y'all that are waiting for the merch shout outs, for everybody that was copying during the last live stream and just throughout the day, no worries. I'm still going to do those shout outs at the end of this live stream, so stay tuned. We're about to get into it though. Y'all ready? I'm ready. Let's go.
One night in 1944, an American military pilot was flying over England when he turned around in his cockpit and looked at this panel of switches that was right behind him. And after looking for a particular switch, he reached out and he was about to toggle it, but he stopped because he knew what he was about to do, flipping this switch, would easily be the most dangerous thing he had ever done in his entire life. But this was his duty. He had to do it. And so after taking a deep breath, he flipped the switch, and immediately chaos ensued, and the course of American history would be drastically changed forever. If you've never heard the story before, and many people have not, this is not nearly as well known as it should be, then you are in for a huge reveal at the end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please secretly log in to the Like Button's computer and then transfer all of their Bitcoin to your untraceable offshore account. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
Bro, I swear we got more channel members in here than we got regular members, y'all. Y'all are deep, man. Channel members deep tonight, baby.
Okay, let's get into today's story.
It's like y'all get the notifications first or something.
At around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of August 12, 1944, a young American military pilot named Joe walked out of his quarters on his base in England where he was stationed. And as soon as he was outside, he lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and as he smoked the cigarette, he began walking towards the huge hangar on the other side of the base where his plane was waiting for him. Joe had been preparing for this night for weeks. He and his co-pilot, a 35-year-old lieutenant who was nicknamed Bud, were about to step off on a top-secret military mission called Operation Aphrodite. And this mission was not only top secret, but it was so unbelievably dangerous that basically anybody who knew about it considered it a suicide mission. But Joe tried not to think about that as he walked towards the hangar. Instead, he tried to think about the reason he was here in the first place, the reason he had joined the military, and that was to defeat the Nazis. And what he and his co-pilot were about to do, Operation Aphrodite, was going to play a huge role in defeating the Nazis. So this was about 5 years into World War II, and at this point, the Nazis were actually losing. However, it was making them more dangerous, not less, because they were becoming very, very desperate. And so they were launching all these outrageous attacks, basically because they had nothing to lose. And one horrible thing the Nazis were doing at this time were dropping these things called vengeance weapons. Hitler called them vengeance weapons. They were basically these huge bombs that the Nazis would drop arbitrarily across the United Kingdom on major population centers. And by this point in the war, these vengeance weapons had killed over 5,000 civilians.
It's interesting. This is ironic at the same time that, Mr. Ballin is telling a story about the troops wanting to take out the Nazis or whatnot. When I just uploaded right before we went live this evening, a video that literally had me in tears on my Patreon. It was a documentary. I'm not going to say the name of it, but it was a documentary that was removed off of YouTube several times. When it was on Netflix, they were forced to take it down because the information was so insane. But I found it. And basically what that documentary does is a lot of the conspiracy theories that we assume are theories, they outline just how true they actually are. The fact that they're not theories, but they're actual facts. From Pizzagate, and the Nazis having something to do with some of this stuff. What else? What else was it? Operation Paperclip, and the list goes on. Spiritual cooking. They talked to Jeffrey Epstein. They talked about a lot of stuff over there. Head over there to Patreon if you want to watch it, but at your own warning. I'm telling you, I'm warning y'all right now. You will be in your feelings the whole time you're watching it, because I was. I think I cried about twice, because this world is evil.
And at this exact moment, like this night, as Joe was walking towards the hangar, the Nazis had a stash of vengeance weapons aimed directly at London. That was going to be their next target. And so the mission that Joe and his co-pilot Bud were going on, Operation Aphrodite, was going to be to go out and destroy those vengeance weapons to save London. And as nervous as Joe was about this mission, and he was really nervous, he was also very excited. He actually had volunteered for this mission when many other pilots had done everything they could to stay away from this mission. And on top of that, Joe actually had flown enough missions by this point in the war that he didn't need to fly any more. He could just go home. But instead, he volunteered for this mission. And a reason why Joe might have decided to do that has a lot to do with the family he was raised in. So Joe came from a family that was very successful and accomplished, and his father really pushed Joe and his younger brother to be the very best at whatever they were doing and to be very competitive with each other. And so while Joe and his younger brother did love each other, they also had a pretty intense rivalry. And for a while, Joe's father obviously favored Joe. I mean, Joe was the favorite child, and, his father would always say, Joe's going to be the president someday. He's so talented. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, both Joe and his younger brother joined the military, and pretty early on in the war, Joe's younger brother got an award for heroism. He had basically saved his platoon of men, and he won all these awards, and he was all over the news. And pretty quickly after that, Joe felt like he fell out of favor with his dad, that his dad kind of looked at the younger brother as being the favorite child now. And so Joe really started to feel insecure and wanted to prove himself really to his dad. And so when Operation Aphrodite came up, Joe volunteered for it really because he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to show his dad that he too could do something huge and change the course of history. And he would change the course of history, but not in the way he expected. And so Joe continued to smoke a cigarette and hustled across the base towards the hangar. And as he did, he found himself kind of speeding up, like he just wanted to get over there and get started. Joe's commanders had given him a special code he would call out over the radio if this mission was successful. It was spade flush. That's what he'd say over the radio. And so as Joe hustled towards the hangar, he imagined how incredible it was going to be to yell out spade flush over the radio. I mean, it was only like 30 minutes away from that moment. This was a short mission. And so finally, Joe reached the hangar and he looked up to the sky one more time to make sure the weather looked solid, because actually they had tried to launch Operation Aphrodite a couple of days earlier, but it had been canceled because of fog. But Joe looked around and the weather looked good, and so he knew it was going to be a go. So he flipped his cigarette butt and stepped into the hangar. Inside this hangar was this massive, big open space. And in the center of the hangar on the floor was this huge plane called a B-24 Liberator. This was, of course, Joe's plane for the night. And so Joe immediately began walking towards the plane to check it out. Now, this particular type of plane was the type of plane Joe had been flying for the past 3 years. I mean, he'd flown many combat missions in this type of aircraft, so he was very familiar with it. But this particular B-24 was unlike any of the other B-24s Joe had ever flown. In fact, this aircraft was so unique, it was unlike any aircraft that any pilot in the American military had ever flown. I mean, this was really a one of one. And so as Joe walked around the outside of this plane, he began to notice some of these unique modifications that the mechanics had made to this aircraft. The most noticeable modification was actually the cockpit. Now, normally the cockpit had all these windows basically all around it, so the pilot could look in any direction and see what was going on, but obviously they needed to be protected from the elements. But this B-24 had all the glass removed except for one pane of glass, basically right in front of where Joe would be staring, just like a single windshield. And so it's almost like it was a convertible aircraft where it was all open air in the cockpit. And the reason for this change is because Joe and his co-pilot, during the course of this top secret mission, Operation Aphrodite, they would have to jump out and parachute to the ground. And so by having this all open, it would allow them to do that much easier. And then another big modification to the B-24 is the guns that were normally located on the outside of the aircraft were gone, and they were replaced by broomsticks painted black to look like guns at a distance. But the visible changes to this particular B-24 were nothing compared to the massive changes that were hidden inside this aircraft. Because the top secret part of Operation Aphrodite was really this particular plane. The plane was not really a plane. It was more like a huge flying bomb. The military's mechanics basically hollowed out the entirety of this plane, removed everything inside of it that was not absolutely vital, and they replaced it with explosives. 10 tons of explosives. Like, this is an unbelievable amount of explosives. A few minutes later, at around 5:55 p.m., Joe and his co-pilot Bud, who by this point had come into the hangar...
Nah. Don't tell me that their idea was, you know what, we're not going to tell the pilots this, but this is a suicide mission? Oh, darn, I just said a word that YouTube is going to be mad at me for. Oops. I was just on Patreon while I was swearing up a storm, so look, I forgot I need to transition back to YouTube language now. But man, that's messed up. Tons of freaking explosives? They took the guns off these planes? Don't tell me they're going to do what I think they're going to do. They probably going to do it, aren't they?
Finished doing their exterior inspection of the aircraft, and then they climbed into the cockpit, with Joe taking a seat in the pilot's seat and Bud sitting in the co-pilot's seat. And even though the evening was cool, both men were visibly sweating. Once the pilots got the go-ahead to begin the mission, Joe fired the first engine and then turned to look at the ground crew all around them, and he noticed all of them looked really, really serious. I mean, they obviously knew how intensely dangerous this mission really was, and the fact was, the pilots might not make it home, and so they're looking up at these guys like, I'm sorry you have to do this. But Joe, he looked out at these people and he sensed that was going on, and so he made a big show to wave and smile at them, to show confidence, like he knew what he was going to do. He's going to be fine. But in reality, Joe really was terrified. In about 10 seconds, I'm going to hold something up in front of the camera that our team has been working on for over a year, and it's finally ready to be revealed, and we know you're going to love it. All right, drum roll please, here we go. And it's the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, delivered in book format. The official Mr. Ballin graphic novel, our first book ever. In this just stunningly beautiful anthology of stories are full stories that are brand new and have never been covered anywhere else on any of our other channels. So if you want to hear those new stories, you got to get this book. The book is not coming out until my birthday, October 1st of this year, but you can pre-order a book.
October babies right here. We are both October's very own.
Right.
OVO.
Now by going to book.ballinstudios.com. The link is...
That book cover, when I tell you, is amazing. It's perfect. It's Mr. Ballin. He got a little fire pit outside. You know, he got skeletons all around him. Skeleton in the moon. That's dope cover art right there. I'm gonna have to get one. I should be wearing my Mr. Ballin t-shirt right now. I got the Ballintines t-shirt. I got one. Freak. I should be wearing it. I'll wear it in the next live stream if I remember.
Also in the description. And if enough of you pre-order this thing, it'll make the New York Times bestseller list, which is so cool. But more importantly, that will show us there's big interest in books from the strange, dark, and mysterious community, and we'll make more of them. So again, head on over to book.ballinstudios.com and pre-order a copy today.
Now, I'm more of a self-development type of reader, but I gotta support the ballin'.
Oh, and also at the end of today's video, be sure you stick around because I'm gonna go live on YouTube, and during this live event, I will tell you a little personal story from my time in Navy boot camp and how that actually led to the creation of this graphic novel. I'll also speak with some very special people that helped make this book a reality, and I'll share some other exclusive details about the book. Oh, and also I will answer any questions you might have about the book. So when this episode ends, just click on the live tab on my YouTube channel to join the live event with me. And again, go to book.ballinstudios.com and pre-order a copy of the Mr. Ballin graphic novel today and help us get on that New York Times bestsellers list. By 5:59 p.m., Joe had all 4 propellers spinning on the aircraft, and so he released the brake and began taxiing out to the runway. And as they bumped along, Joe and Bud became really aware of just how heavy this aircraft was from all the explosives. I mean, every bump, this plane is lurching up and down and really creaking and making lots of noises. I mean, this was sketchy. Finally, Joe went full speed ahead, and he and Joe went tearing down the runway, and at some point, the plane did get lift, and it took off into the air. And then just up ahead of him were 6 other planes that had just taken off moments before, who were going to escort Joe and Bud to their target area. Once Joe got the plane to its cruising altitude, he and Bud kind of relaxed for a second and began preparing themselves for what was going to happen next. They had about 15 minutes of just kind of casual flying before the real work of this mission began.
What up, Christian?
The vengeance weapons that Joe and Bud were going out to destroy as part of Operation Aphrodite were located about 120 miles south, just outside of this little town in the very northern tip of France. But destroying these weapons would not be as simple as just Joe and Bud flying over top and releasing all their explosives and flying back home, because the Nazis had buried these vengeance weapons deep inside the hills in this town in northern France. And so regular bombs wouldn't touch these vengeance weapons. They had to do it a different way. And the way they were going to do it was Joe and Bud were going to fly their plane directly into the hills. And the way they would do this is they would fly their plane as close to the target area as possible, at which point one of the other pilots that were in the escort planes would take remote control of the B-24 flying bomb. And then once they had remote control, Joe and Bud, who no longer needed to do anything, they would jump out and parachute to the ground. And then the pilot who was remotely flying this now vacant B-24 flying bomb, they would just set it on autopilot to crash into the hills. At around 6:15 p.m., just as the English Channel came into view, Joe toggled a switch on his control panel, and then after he did, he and Bud kind of held their breath for a second to see what would happen. And then a couple of seconds later, the plane kind of shuddered for a second and then leveled out. And then a call came over the radio from one of the pilots who were in the escort planes telling Joe and Bud that they had just successfully taken remote control of the B-24. So at this point, Joe and Bud are no longer flying the aircraft. They're just sitting inside of this flying bomb. Now, there were only two things left for Joe and Bud to do before they could bail out to safety. They would need to arm the plane, so basically arm the explosives and make them ready to detonate. And then after that was done, they would need to call out over the radio, spade flush, the code Joe was given, which would signal to everybody else that the plane was ready and Joe and Bud were jumping out. And so once Joe and Bud nodded to each other and kind of acknowledged that, okay, we're going to do the last bit of this mission, Joe turned around in his seat and he looked at this control panel that was right behind him. And on this panel was the arming switch. And so once Joe flipped this, he and Bud would have a very short window of time to safely escape the aircraft. And so it was kind of like, flip it, make the radio call, and get the heck out of there. But Joe and Bud had trained for this moment over and over and over again, so they were ready. And so eventually, Joe flipped the switch, grabbed his radio, and called out, spade flush. What Joe and Bud could not have known when the mechanics were making all these modifications to this B-24 was that one of the mechanics accidentally crossed some wires in putting in all these explosives. And so just seconds after Joe had armed the explosives, they detonated. They were not supposed to, but they did. And so Joe and Bud were killed basically a fraction of a second after calling out spade flush. But it would turn out the catastrophic failure of Operation Aphrodite had no impact on World War II.
Misty, shout out to you. Thank you for the donation, big baby.
In fact, Operation Aphrodite should never have happened in the first place. It was totally unnecessary. What Joe and Bud and the rest...
I ain't gonna lie, I was like, this operation seems unnecessary.
The American military didn't know at the time was 5 weeks earlier, the British Royal Air Force dropped a whole bunch of ground-penetrating bombs all across those hills in northern France, and they destroyed all of the vengeance weapons. So when Joe and Bud took off on this doomed mission, there was no threat to London. None. But that is not the big reveal in this story, because Operation Aphrodite changed the course of American history in a really specific and really enormous way. Because Joe, whose full name was Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., was a member of the very famous Kennedy family, a big-time political family in America. And at the time, the Kennedys were all saying, Joseph is going to be the next president of the United States. And everybody believed it. He was going to be the guy. But then, of course, Operation Aphrodite changed all of that because Joseph was killed. And so the war would end about a year later, and when it did, Joseph's younger brother, John F. Kennedy, who won that award for heroism and got a Purple Heart early on in the war, and he kind of became a war hero, which prompted Joe to volunteer for Operation Aphrodite. Yeah, John would begin his unbelievable political rise. And by 1960, John F. Kennedy, JFK, would become the 35th president of the United States, even though he wasn't supposed to. He was the second choice. It should have been Joe.
Wow, that's great. Oh, this is a part of history I never knew anything about. I never knew anything about this. Yo, this fool should have been president, but instead his brother got it. That's crazy. Life, man. But what if some things happened, some events occurred, because it's kind of almost like the what's the movies, Final Destination, where no matter how much you try to avoid the thing happening, it's still gonna happen to you. So even though people wanted him to be the president, maybe even if that incident didn't occur, he probably still wouldn't have been the president. But nonetheless, that's a crazy story I knew nothing of. Now I got stories to tell somebody. I'm like, hey, you heard about John F. Kennedy, brother? The guy that was supposed to be the president? Let me tell you about him. Yeah, exactly, Felicia. I ain't never heard nothing about this. They don't teach this junk. They don't teach this. The documentary that I did on Patreon not too long ago, they said something at the end of it. They were like, the truth is learned, not taught. The truth is learned, not taught. Okay? I was like, man, if that ain't true. Boy. We got one more Mr. Ballin' video. This one's a little bit short. It's about 17 minutes long, but this next one is well over 20.
Today's story is about 4 teenage friends.
Almost 30 minutes long. It's titled The stunning ending to this mystery will completely play with your emotions. Oh man, I just got finished crying on Patreon. I ain't ready for this again. Let's go.
Today's story is about 4 teenage friends who decide to go camping in this big, beautiful forest in Finland that's right near this huge lake. And when they get there, it's awesome. There's so many people there. The weather's perfect. They're having a great time. But that night, it turned into an absolute nightmare because someone or something paid those teens an unwanted visit. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to change the oil in the like button's car, but after draining it all out, go ahead and replace it with horse manure. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1960, a 15-year-old girl named Mela Bjorklund climbed off the back of her boyfriend's motorcycle. Her boyfriend was an 18-year-old named Nils Gustafsson, and this couple had just driven 18 miles from the city in southern Finland where they lived to get to this beautiful forest and lake where they, along with another couple, were going to go camping. The other couple, who was still a few minutes behind them, was Nils's best friend, Seppo, and his girlfriend, whose name was Anja. As Nils parked his motorcycle, Mela looked out over the lake, and she saw it was totally beautiful, the forest completely wrapped around the lake, and there were all these people out on the lake, boating and swimming and having a great time. But despite all these people here, to Mela, it still kind of felt very quiet and peaceful. This didn't feel like a big touristy destination. It really felt like they were out in the wild. And for Mela, who loved the outdoors, this felt like a great spot to celebrate her 16th birthday. Because that's actually why the couples were out camping. Mela was turning 16 in a couple of days, and so this was going to be her party. Just then, Mela heard another motorcycle approaching, and she turned around and she saw it was the other couple. It was Seppo who was driving, and Anja was right behind him. And Seppo, he looked up and saw Mela looking at him, and he grinned and braked hard with his motorcycle and kind of swung the back wheel out like he was in an action movie. And Mela thought it was totally funny, and she started laughing, and that's when Nils turned around and he saw his girlfriend laughing heartily at Seppo. A moment later, all 4 friends were giving each other hugs and saying hello, and then after catching up, the friends walked over to this small shack that was right by the water. It was the snack kiosk. Their plan was to load up on supplies and then quickly make their way into the forest where they'd actually be camping and just relax, enjoy the night, and go to bed. But as the friends walked towards the snack kiosk, Seppo made a joke about how his motorcycle was way better than Nils's motorcycle. And Mela, who was Nils's boyfriend, she laughed at this joke and thought it was really funny. But as she was laughing, she happened to look over at Nils, her own boyfriend, and she could tell, he just looked upset, like he was scowling at her and also at Seppo. And immediately, Mela felt really bad because she was thinking, maybe Nils thinks I'm flirting with Seppo by laughing at all of his jokes. And so Mela really did not want Nils to think anything was going on with her and Seppo because there was nothing going on. But when Mela looked over at Nils again to kind of confirm that he really did look mad, he didn't look mad. He was smiling and laughing again. And so Mela told herself, she must have just imagined that Nils was never upset. It was all in her head. So Mela reached over and grabbed Nils's hand, and the 2 couples walked the rest of the way over to the kiosk. The snack kiosk was really just this little shack right near the beach, and then behind the shack was a small house where the owners of the snack kiosk lived. And as soon as they got up to the kiosk, Mela noticed the woman who was manning the kiosk had her back to them and didn't seem remotely interested in turning around and helping them get what they needed. And so Mela was just like, okay, hey, excuse me, we just want to buy something. And the woman at this point, she whipped her head around and she looked at Mela really angrily and just said, "What do you want?" And Mela, who was totally taken aback by this, she kind of mumbled an apology, not really even sure if she did something wrong or not. And then she asked the woman if they could just get a couple of beers and sodas and they'd be on their way. And as this is happening, Seppo and Anja, who were right behind Mela, they were just giggling the whole time because this woman's behavior was so bizarre and so unexpected, they just couldn't help themselves. So as the teenagers are giggling, this woman is bending down and getting the sodas and beer, and she's huffing really angrily like this is such a huge inconvenience, and then she just slammed them up on the counter. As the woman was punching in the total into the cash register, Mela found herself looking over at the house behind the shack where this woman presumably lived, and Mela noticed there were all these empty beer bottles that lined the front railing of the house. And so Mela figured, maybe this was a clue as to why this woman was so hostile. Any household that produced that many empty beer cans likely was not a very happy place to live. And so finally, the woman in the kiosk gave the teenagers their total, at which point Nils stepped forward and he actually paid for the stuff instead of Mela. And then as Nils and Mela grabbed the things they bought and were about to turn and leave, the woman in the kiosk kind of cleared her voice and she asked them, hey, are you camping out by the lake? And to Mela, it seemed like this woman was suddenly being really nice, maybe as a way to kind of make up for how rude she was when they first walked over. And so Mela put on a smile and told this woman that, we're staying out by the lake. We're really excited about it. Thanks for asking. But the woman did not seem happy to hear this. Instead, the woman kind of scowled and then told them that they better set their tent as far away from here as possible. None of the teenagers had any idea how to respond to this. So they just kind of stood there, and there was this really intense, awkward silence for a moment. And then the kiosk lady just began literally shooing the teenagers away, telling them to go, get out of here. And so finally the teenagers did turn around and started walking. But after walking pretty far away from the kiosk, they heard the kiosk woman yell out at them one more time. She basically yelled at them that her and her family had already had lots of trouble with wild teenagers in the past camping out around this lake. And so now she and her husband were totally sick of it. And so after the kiosk lady yelled out this final comment, Seppo and Nils and Anja, they just started laughing because it just seemed so absurd how disrespectful and awful this woman was being, to the point where it was comical. But Mela, she didn't think it was funny. She seemed mean and very angry, and it totally freaked Mela out. But just a couple of minutes later, the teens were back at their motorcycles, and Nils and Mela hopped on one, and Seppo and Anja hopped on the other, and then they began driving down this wooded path that would take them to their campsite. The ride to their campsite was a very short one, and where they were positioned was on this piece of land that sort of jutted out onto the lake. It was very heavily forested, and so it's this amazing view of the water, but it's very secluded in the trees. And so right away, Nils and Seppo, they parked their motorcycles up against the trees, they pulled out a simple canvas tent, and they strung it up between two birch trees, and then with their campsite all set up, they grabbed some beers, and the friends began to drink. And it didn't take long before Mela had totally forgotten about the kiosk woman and how awful she had been. After all, Mela had really been looking forward to this trip, and now she was here at the campsite, relaxing with her friends. I mean, this was great. Also, Mela was really excited about her relationship with Nils. It was a relatively new one, and it was obvious that, for once, her boyfriend was somebody who liked her as much as she liked him. And also, Nils was very handsome, and he was popular, and he had this dark brown hair that he combed straight up, and he always wore this leather jacket everywhere. And so Mela just really liked being around him. He was super cool and made her feel really grown up. After sitting around for about 30 minutes to an hour, just having a couple of drinks and swapping stories and kind of easing into their night, the friends eventually made their way down to the water, and they went swimming for a while, and they continued to drink down by the dock. And then when they were tired of swimming, the teens just laid on the dock and enjoyed looking out at the sunset. Even though actually in Finland at this time of the year, it's not really a sunset because the sun does not actually fully set. And so when this happens, these are known as white nights, which are very beautiful. I mean, it's kind of like this hazy glow in the sky from the sun not quite setting. And so on this night, the teens are out there on the dock. They had this beautiful, white night to look up at. And for Mela, she felt like this was the perfect birthday celebration. In fact, she would jot down in her diary later that night just how amazing everything was going and how much fun she was having with Nils and their friends. Finally, the teens were done down by the dock, so they grabbed their things, they went back up to the campsite, they dried off, they changed, and then all four of them piled into their one little tent to go to sleep. And eventually, all four of them would drift off to sleep, but then at some point in the middle of the night, Mela woke up. And she heard rustling sounds outside the tent, and so she wondered if, maybe one of the friends had gotten up, and so she sat up and looked out the tent, and she couldn't see anything. She just saw the kind of hazy night sky from the white night, and she couldn't really tell if everybody was inside the tent or not. But then suddenly, a dark, shadowy figure moved in front of the tent flap, the open tent flap. And so this shadowy figure totally blocked all the light that was coming into the tent from the white night. And then this shadowy figure looked into the tent, and they had these bright, glowing red eyes. And before Mela or anybody else in the tent could do anything, there was a snapping sound and the tent fell down on top of them.
What? Oh.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I spiraled into a terrible depression in 2018, amazingly, I actually didn't know it. I thought it was totally normal to be mad basically all the time and to be irritated with everyone and everything around me basically constantly. I figured...
Interesting. So, Mr. Ball talking about his depression right now, talking about being mad all the time and irritated with everybody. Is that common? Because I dealt with the same thing.
If I just waited long enough, I'd feel better again. But I didn't. Over time, I just got worse and worse and more upset and more angry, and I isolated more and more. That is, until my wife and family stepped in and said, you really need to see someone. Like, you need to get help. Now, I balked at this suggestion at first, because again, I didn't realize I was depressed, but I ultimately did, kind of for their benefit, go and seek out a therapist, and my goodness, am I glad I did that. My therapist quickly identified that I definitely was depressed, and my depression was very likely linked to my ongoing struggles to readapt to civilian life. And so, with my therapist's help, I was able to kind of work through these issues and come up with a plan to get better. And over time, that plan worked. I became happy again. Look, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're struggling right now and you don't know what to do, therapy is a great starting point. And a great therapy platform to try, especially for those who have never used therapy before, is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. After filling out a brief survey online, BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. You can also switch therapists at any time at no additional cost. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you right from the comfort of your own home.
Now, I let these BetterHelp ads play every single time because getting some help is better than getting none. Don't think that you're too big or too bold, too strong-minded to seek some help when needed.
Visit BetterHelp.com/Mr. Ballin or just click on Mr. Ballin during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. The next morning at 6 a.m., two boys who were not in any way connected to these four teenagers were at this lake. They were over to the side doing some fishing, and they were looking kind of out generally in the direction of where the four teenagers had stayed the night before. And this particular day, the lake was not remotely crowded like it was the day before. Basically, it was a ghost town. And suddenly they saw emerge from the forest, basically where the teens had camped, was this young man with blonde hair who was just running away from where that campsite was. And so these boys just stared for a second at this random guy with blonde hair running away from the campsite until the boys lost interest and just went back to fishing. As the morning wore on, more and more people came to the lake, but nobody made their way out to the campsite where the teenagers had been the night before. That is, until a father and his two sons decided to head out that way to go to that dock to go swimming. And so this father and his sons began walking on the same wooded trail that Nils and Seppo had driven their motorcycles on to get out to that camping site. And he eventually makes it to the clearing in the forest where this campsite was. And right away, he spots what looks like a crumpled heap of canvas kind of sitting between two trees. And he couldn't really tell what it was. And so the father walked a little bit closer to investigate. And eventually he realized what they were actually walking up on, at which point he threw up a hand to stop his sons from going any closer, and he turned around and he told his kids, we have to leave right now. And so the father and his sons, they run back up that trail, they find a phone, and they call the police. When the police arrived at the lake just before noon, they would walk out to that campsite and they would see that crumpled heap of canvas, and then also in and around that crumpled heap were the four bodies of the four teenagers who had stayed there the night before. Anja and Seppo had not even made it out of the tent. They had been beaten and stabbed to death basically through the canvas fabric. Mela did manage to get out of the tent. However, she did not escape. She was kind of laying on top of the tent, and she had broken bones, and it would turn out she was stabbed a total of 15 times, and some of those stabs came when she was alive, and some came when she was dead. And then laying next to her was the body of her boyfriend Nils, and he was basically unrecognizable. His head had been beaten to a pulp. As officers descended on the scene and began rifling through the teenagers' backpacks and different belongings, one officer knelt down.
See, man, I've never been camping before, and I don't want this to scare me away from camping, but you never know. You never know, especially if you're going to an actual campsite.
Near all the victims to look more closely at each of their injuries. And as they were looking at each of the victims, they suddenly heard this gasping sound. It was very faint, but they could definitely hear it. And to their shock, Nils, so Mela's boyfriend, he suddenly opened his eyes and he looked up at this officer. He was still alive. And this officer who's seeing this, who was totally convinced Nils was dead, as everybody else was at first unsure what to even do, but then a second later, the officer stood up and began screaming for a medic. After Nils was taken away in an ambulance, the different investigative teams that had descended on the scene began going over the evidence and different things they had found, and pretty quickly, the general feel amongst all the investigators was this crime scene does not make any sense. There were some things missing from the crime scene that seemed to indicate this could have been a robbery, like missing wallets and missing watches, but there were other things that were missing that just didn't really make any sense to have been taken. Like, for example, the 2 motorcycles that the boys drove in, they were still there, parked up against the tree, but their keys were gone. So why steal the keys and not take the motorcycles? And then also, Nils's prized leather jacket and his shoes were also missing. These were not particularly valuable. I mean, they might have been emotionally valuable to Nils, but they certainly were not valuable enough to warrant a robber, killing people to get their hands on them. So eventually, the police actually called in the military to come into the forest and help with the search. And when the military arrived and began fanning out all around this huge forest...
Hey, I hit that like button for Mr. Ballin.
They would make a really big discovery. They would find Nils's shoes. And these shoes were speckled with blood. And it was clear from the bloody tracks nearby that the killer must have, at some point, put these shoes on at the campsite and then walked away while still wearing them, and then ultimately, ditched them 500 meters away underneath that pile of leaves. In the days after the murders, the police chased down
Miss Latrell. Shout out to you, gifting the channel with 5 channel memberships. Make sure y'all thank her. Shout out to Nicole as well. She did the same thing. Make sure y'all thank her. And James, the $5 dono. Appreciate you, big baby.
Dozens of leads all over Finland, but none of them amounted to anything. Nils would actually survive the attack, but his face was so badly damaged with so many broken bones in his head that it took a really long time before he could even speak.
Wow.
But when he finally could, and the police were able to interview him, it became immediately clear that Nils did not have a good memory of the attack. And in fact, the day of the attack, basically the whole day, he didn't really remember it. However, Nils would remember one thing. He said during the chaos of the actual attack, he distinctly remembered seeing a dark, shadowy figure with these bright red, glowing eyes. But the police couldn't just go out and look for a dark figure with red eyes, and so instead they just made a note of this and continued their investigation. The only real lead the police got were from those 2 boys who were fishing out on the lake a day after the murders happened, where they saw that guy with blonde hair running away from where the teens had camped. Now, these 2 boys didn't know the significance of what they were seeing, but obviously when the news broke about the murders, they recalled seeing that guy right in the area where they now knew, that's where the murders had happened. And so the police created a composite sketch of, what the boys thought they saw, this blonde guy running, and they would send this sketch all over Finland, and they would ask people, to come forward if you've seen this guy. And loads of people immediately came forward and said, yep, I've seen that guy. But it would turn out the police were getting loads of false reports because the sketch looked like lots of men in Finland. So this was not a unique enough sketch, basically. However, there was one tip that came into police that did really stand out. The day after the murders happened, a man named Hans Osman checked into a hospital located about 13 miles away from where the lake was, where the murders happened. And this guy, Hans, when he checks into the hospital, he starts complaining of having these really intense stomach pains. But the doctors don't believe him because Hans actually just appears to be very drunk and very aggressive. First of all, he looked exactly like the police composite sketch of the blonde running guy.
Yeah.
Like he was that guy. And also, Hans was filthy. He was covered in dirt and mud, and there was all this dirt kind of embedded in his fingernails like he had been digging with his hands. And he also had all these red stains all over his clothes that he refused to explain. And so eventually, one of the doctors called the police, and when the police interviewed Hans, they would discover that he had a history of violence, and he also said he used to be a member of the Nazi Party, and he also was a member of the Russian secret police, and all of this just seemed like
I would get rid of him.
A lot.
I would send him back to wherever the heck he think he came from.
But basically, he seemed like a very erratic and unstable person. But Hans had a rock-solid alibi. On the night of the murder, Hans was located in a city about 15 miles away from where the murders happened, at his girlfriend's house with his girlfriend and also his girlfriend's sister and brother-in-law. And so as much as they wanted Hans to be their guy, the police learned, obviously he's not. And this was basically how the entire investigation went. The police would interview over 4,000 people, but despite all that, they still could not figure out who did this. And so slowly, the case went cold. And that was it for 44 years. Lots of theories, but not one suspect. But then, in 2004, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They said the killer was Nils Gustafsson, the 18-year-old boyfriend of Mela.
I knew it was coming.
Who was the only one who survived the attack. And the prosecutors pointed to two pieces of evidence to support this theory. The first piece of evidence was there was this woman who was staying out at the lake on the night of the murders, not far from the teenagers' campsite, who remembered overhearing two men really aggressively fighting before the murders ultimately happened. Prosecutors hypothesized that what that woman overheard was Nils and Seppo fighting with each other. That Nils was mad at Seppo about something to do with Nils's girlfriend, Mela. Perhaps he really was upset that it seemed like Mela was flirting with Seppo, and so Nils felt betrayed. But, something was happening there where these two young men were fighting over a girl. In the prosecutor's eyes, this would also explain why Mela had been stabbed so many times. That basically Nils must have been so furious about whatever was happening between Mela and Seppo, and then, his rage took over and he really took it out on his girlfriend. The second piece of evidence the prosecutors used to support this idea that Nils was the killer were Nils's shoes, which were found under those leaves about...
This is what I was thinking. I was like, ooh, they found his shoes? Nah, he did it.
500 meters away from their campsite. The prosecutor said there was blood on the shoes, but not in the shoes. And none of the blood that were on these shoes belonged to Nils. And so prosecutors say that shows Nils murdered his friends while wearing his shoes and then, ran away from the campsite and ditched those shoes to hide them, underneath those leaves. And then he came back to the campsite and inflicted those horrible injuries on himself to make it seem like he also had been attacked.
Wow.
So in the end,
this man really went hammer, literally messing himself up so that it can seem like he didn't do this heinous crime, to the point where he couldn't even talk for months. He messed himself up that bad. If they truly if they truly believe that he did this.
Nils, 44 years after the fact, got arrested for these murders. And at the time he was arrested, Nils was 62 years old, he was working as a bus driver, and he was married with kids. But at Nils's trial, he absolutely maintained his innocence and did not waver from his story one bit. He basically said, look, I can't remember all the details of that day. I don't remember the attack very well. I don't really know what we did leading up to it, what happened after it. But what I do remember is I saw a dark, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. That's all I remember. And the jury completely believed him, and he was easily acquitted, and in the end, Finland would even give him a huge monetary settlement for his mental suffering. Today, people tell lots of stories about these murders. I mean, the lake itself where this happened, Lake Bodom, is now completely famous for these murders. People go there just to be in the same place where these teens were killed. But a lot of the stories that circulate about these murders are so far-fetched that they just do not seem believable, like suggesting that the campsite was cursed and that, the ghosts of murdered campers attacked the teens. It just does not seem like a viable theory. Other stories that circulate are really intriguing, but they don't really get you anywhere. Like periodically there's this photo that will circulate on the internet, and it's a picture of the crowd at one of the teens' funerals, and in the middle of this crowd is this guy whose face looks identical to that composite sketch of the running blonde man. And in fact, people have come out and said he looks exactly like that guy Hans Osman, who had shown up in the hospital, you know, the day after the murders with the dirt and what looked like blood all over him, but he had that alibi. And so that picture makes its rounds on the internet, and everybody gets jazzed up and says, there he is, that's the guy who killed the teens. But no one's ever been able to actually identify that person, and so it's gone nowhere. But there is one story that circulates about these murders that a lot of people believe is the truth. When the teenagers were killed, there was a 55-year-old man named Carl Voldemar Gilstrom who lived right on Lake Bodom. And Carl had a reputation for being really nasty and sometimes even lashing out at the campers who stayed in this area. And in fact, Carl would often get drunk and literally go and attack the other campers. He would cut down their tents in the middle of the night, he would throw rocks at their campsite, and then one time, he even fired a gun at a camper who was riding past him on a moped. He missed, but I mean, this guy is an absolute nightmare. And so after the murders happened, locals who knew about Carl immediately went to police, and they were like, that's the guy who very likely did this. I mean, this is totally something he would do. But when police went and tried to speak to Carl, they wound up speaking to Carl's wife, who was the kiosk woman, the woman who was so nasty to the teens when they first arrived and basically told them to get away. Yeah, so the police talked to her, and she would tell police that Carl was with her and her kids when the murders happened. And so the police believed her and never really considered Carl a serious suspect. But in the Lake Bodom area, when people heard he was not being looked at closely, people felt like this was a huge mistake. But 9 years after the murders, so at this point the case is totally cold, Carl is having a drink with his neighbor out near the Lake Bodom area, and as they're just sitting there having drinks, relaxing, Carl winds up admitting to the neighbor that he was the Lake Bodom murderer. He literally said to his neighbor, don't you understand that I'm the murderer of Bodom? And the neighbor apparently was so caught off guard and so horrified by this that they said to Carl, well, if that's the truth, you should go drown yourself. And then the next day, where was Carl found? Out in the lake, drowned, right near where the teens had been attacked. Now, the police were never able to actually figure out if his death was accidental, or if he had done it to himself, or if somebody else had done it to him, but that's the story, and lots of people believe that Carl was so racked with guilt over what he had done that he did what his neighbor suggested.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Are you a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious?
Man, these stories, bro. These stories are like movies, man. That's why Mr. Ballin does a phenomenal job of telling these stories. Because I literally be sitting here and it's like the movie of the story is playing in my head. What? They should make a movie out of that for real. Detail it exactly that way. But anyway, y'all, I had a great time hanging out with y'all this evening. I'm about to do these shout outs as promised. There's a bunch of y'all too. So listen up for your names. And then I got to run. I have to run. I got to go buy some boxes real quick. I forgot to do that earlier today because I'm trying to get y'all orders out the door. And some of y'all I need boxes for because y'all ordered a ton of stuff. So let me go ahead and do these shout outs. And then I'll be out of y'all hair. All right. Peyton was hitting me up. Peyton was in here earlier saying, when are the orders going out? Yeah, the orders are going out all this week. Shout out to you, Peyton. Courtney, shout out to you. Deanna, shout out to you. Anna, Mark, Daniela, Sean. Oh, hold on. I shouted y'all out yesterday. My bad. My bad. Crystal, shout out to you. Kyle, Thomas, Joanne, Sandra, Sheila, Eric, Emily, shout out to you. Brittany, Kelly, Amanda, I appreciate you. Renona, I like that name. Shout out to you. Jessica, shout out to you twice because you came back for a double take. Darren, Kelly, hold on, is this the same Kelly? Wait, we got two Kellys in here. Oh no, wait, the other was Kyle, my bad. No, there was two Kelly. Kelly Race and Kelly Petis, shout out to you. I think that's how you pronounce your middle name. Mark Bell, shout out to you. Michael, Miss Pearson, shout out to you. Joe, I want to ruin your first name. I don't want to say it wrong. Rob, shout out to you. Corey, Toby came back twice on us. Shout out to you. Steven, Crystal. Look, Crystal always buying stuff for herself and for them girls and for her mama. Shout out to Crystal. Kevin, Nestor, shout out to you. Tracy, Ebony, y'all, this is crazy. Melissa, Serenity, always coming up in here with the orders. Angela, Jeanette, Timothy. God, y'all, look. When I tell y'all, more than half of those blankets are gone right now. More than half of those blankets. So grab them while you can. Where was I? Timothy, James, shout out to you. Tangela, shout out to you. Aaron, Michelle, that's Michelle Garner right there. Daytona. Why I call you Daytona? Because I'm about to go to Daytona. Dakota, Karen, shout out to you. Oh my God, how you say this name? How you say your last name? Demano, shout out to you. Evelyn, Nakia, Jessica, Sherry, Sky, Jennifer. I did it. That was a lot. That was a whole lot of people. Oh my God. Thank you all so much. Shout out to all of y'all. I told you I'm about to be up to about 3 a.m. getting these orders together, but I got to run. The store closes in literally 40 minutes, and I got to go get some boxes. So thank y'all. I'm gonna try to get y'all some content tomorrow. Go head over to Patreon if you want a 2-hour long documentary, crazy documentary. One day, if I put it on YouTube, the powers that be would come after me. Head over to Patreon and go check that out. It's live right now. But anyway, I'm gonna catch y'all later. Y'all be safe. Have a great evening, and I'm gonna see y'all in the next one. Peace.